Jane Jacobs was an iconoclast. She challenged all the basic core beliefs of a great many fields of discipline, including planning and, surprisingly, economics. But today we're going to look at her challenges to economics, and in particular economic development. For Jane Jacobs, she believed that economic development happens in a city, and in particular because there's a huge population there. Now, for her, there were three things that you can do to increase the economy. One, you can just do more work. You can produce more. You can find efficiency gains. You can find expansion of what you're already doing. This, she felt, was what everybody studied. This is what the typical theories would talk about, the factors of production and how to optimize their division and all that stuff. She didn't talk about this at all because she felt that it was already talked about by a great many people. She also felt that this was the least important from the perspective of economic development. The second thing that a city or a country could do to develop its economy is to replace imports with domestically produced alternatives, and preferably better than the other ones at a lower cost. This, she felt, was much more important and absolutely critical. However, the most important thing, according to her, is to find really new kinds of work. And by that, we would be talking about that, something like innovation. But it's a little bit deeper than that. She's talking about things that would develop their own new markets. And for her, it was absolutely critical that you do this, because if you're not growing, you're actually stagnating. For her, economic development meant that you're developing a new way of doing things. And by doing that, you're staving off de-development or stagnation. Her theory went like this. Everything that we do today, and have done in the past and will do in the future, has been different. So she gives an example of carriage makers. For a long time, carriage makers were the height of the industry. But today, we've got planes, automobiles, and trains, so it's not necessary to be really efficient or really mass-producing carriages, horse-drawn carriages. If our entire industry was based on that, and we didn't adapt, we would have been stuck in the 18th century. The same is going to be true for everything that we do today. A more modern example would be, how do we listen to music? When I grew up, we used LPs, then we used CDs. Now we stream them. Everything is going to change, and if we don't adapt, we're going to be left behind. So it's critical for the economy of cities and for the economy of the nation to find the best way to expand really new work, that kind of stuff that will change the market and develop a new market. The difficult thing to understand about developing new work, for her perspective, is that you can't really plan for it. It just happens, and it's extremely inefficient. It's inefficient because it requires trial and error and many failures. So Thomas Edison's development of the light bulb, allegedly he went through 10,000 different filaments. That is the process of economic development for her, because there's huge amounts of trial and error, and there's no guarantee of success. Now, the problem for most people is that those tools that lead to economic development often work against economic expansion. So, for example, if you have really top-notch employees in a company, and the company is doing everything it can to keep them there, this is really good for the company and for the consumers and the stockholders of that company. However, if these employees were to leave the company, start their own, compete against this original company, and develop something new, this is in fact what is best for the long-term sustainability of economic development. As long as we have workers that are prevented from starting their own businesses, we are stagnating. We can in fact be expanding the current levels of work, but we would be shortchanging our future. She also points out that banks, for example, are always way behind the times, in the sense that they know what they want to invest in because it's tried and tested. However, new and innovative things are not tried and tested and are therefore not going to be supported by banks. This is an example of how the system is actually set up to help expansion of current work or current development, but not new development. And she doesn't say that we can't have banks and all that kind of stuff, of course not. What she's saying is that banks are not the tool for economic development. They may be the tools for economic expansion. She also points out that There's a tendency in late capitalism, for example, for manufacturers and producers of all kinds to amalgamate, to become bigger, to find efficiencies through economies of scale and mass production. She sees this also as a force against economic development, because what you get is standardization. Standardization, again, is really good for finding the cheapest and most economical way of doing something, but it makes it harder to find newly developed ways of doing things. So she advocates for small local enterprises that compete against each other and would prefer that we make it difficult for grand amalgamations to take place, because those forces are good for economic expansion but not economic development. So she also claims that there's a whole set of social institutions that are harmful for economic development. Slavery, caste, honor, rank, guilds, oligarchies, cartels, and monopolies. All of these function to keep the status quo, to keep their particular fiefdoms in power. And insofar as those are powerful, economic development is not going to be happening as much as it could be. She further goes on to say that new work is always the solution to any existing problem. Everything that we do comes with new problems that develop as a result of it. That is the impetus for new economic development, new ways of doing things, new products, new services. However, if any of those social institutions get in the way of economic and political mobility of the citizens, of the people, they work against economic development, but in favor of the status quo. And in this case, the status quo may be an indentured servitude. So she's fighting against these institutions as well, because they hinder the long-term development of any country or any city. She also has as an article of faith that if there is a persistent problem in society, this is a sign of decadence. And for her, decadence means there are established interests that are working very hard to prevent the solutions that could be coming out of the population. And the reason they do this is to protect their own fiefdoms, their own businesses, their own status, and their own wealth. But what she's got to say is that economic development always works against the existing privileged group. And insofar as it does that, that group will always be fighting against it, even as they appear to be helping the local economy by expanding their production. But it's only short term, again, because she says we're all going to be doing things differently in the future. And if we don't keep up, we're going to be falling behind, just like the carriage makers. So she says that economic development follows a J-curve in respect to economic efficiency gains and economic expansion. So economic expansion and efficiency gains will help economic development to a point. Then they start to hinder economic development, and at a point, they actually really stop it. They're actually fighting against economic development because it becomes too efficient, too much is focused in on one particular existing form of expansion to the detriment of everything else, and there's no opportunity for this new way of doing things to take hold. An example of this, she wrote this book in '69, or she published it in '69, and she labeled Detroit a stagnant city. Now, at the time, she was laughed at because Detroit was at its height at that time. It was a height of culture. The automobile industry was at its best, but she described it as stagnant. And the reason it was is because it wasn't doing anything new. It was focusing all its resources pretty much into the automobile industry. Fast forward to today, we can see that Detroit was in fact stagnating and has stagnated for quite a while. And it may be showing signs of revitalizing now, but it went through that major down period because it focused too much on mass production, efficiencies, and economies of scale to the detriment of everything else. And so when foreign competition came in, they were unable to compete. So the process of development works with two reciprocating systems: the domestic economy and the economy for export. Within the domestic economy, there is the consumption items, and then there's the production items. Those productions can be for consumption or for export. Within the export market, we have everything that is being sent out of the city and being returned income to buy other things. This is the basic way that almost all economists actually agree that the world works. You start off with exports, you improve your exports, that buys income that you can buy more imports. Then you replace those imports with locally produced goods and services, thereby increasing the amount of wealth in the community, which can then buy more exports. These two reciprocating systems are what has been used throughout history, and every time and every place that there has been economic development in order to grow one's economy. It is no different from a hunter-gatherer town to a Midwestern town to the biggest metropolises. The only difference is that there are always more opportunities the more people there are in a particular city. Jane Jacobs then criticizes GDP, during her time it was GNP, as the measure of economic growth. It's more properly to say this is what's happening with the trading of money for goods and services within an economy. It does not measure economic development. In order to measure economic development, she suggests that we look at the ratio of new work to old work. And to do this, first, we look at the increase in exports relative to imports, and secondly, the import replacing relative to production. If you look at these two, you will have a better sense of whether your city or your country is actually developing or stagnating. But the systems of economics that we live in today doesn't count this. They only count transactions. And that measures essentially economic expansion, which is not as important as economic development.
Okay, Jeff, cool TED Talk.
Thank you.
So how can we apply this Jane Jacobs theory of development in cities to a city maybe like Kingston, for example?
I'm glad you asked. I've been trying to point out this to many people, but it doesn't seem to be working. So the reason that there's economic development is because there's trial and error. People are trying to do new things in new different ways. So if we reduce the cost of doing business for a local entrepreneur, the chances of that happening expand. It's never guaranteed, but it expands. So if the city were to provide legal services, accounting services, basic business services at cost to new and local startups, that would reduce their need for money, which is the biggest reason that businesses fail in the initial parts, and hope that they can expand and succeed. If they have a better chance of success, because we're providing it at a lower cost, that would be one way that Kingston could expand its opportunities.
And so, to the degree that this isn't happening, that might be because of certain entrenched interests?
Yes. So one of them is an ideology that says that government should not be competing with businesses. So I believe that Jane Jacobs would say that that may be true under certain circumstances, but if you want to foster economic development, we, as a local community, may want to compete with KPMG to provide accounting services at a lower cost to locals. We may want to partner with legal firms, local legal firms, to offer at a pro bono or at a very discounted rate legal advice to local entrepreneurs. And the reason that this is important is because people who think up new ways and new things to do and new ways of doing them aren't usually legal experts or accounting experts or marketing experts, and they need to go to the market to get those things. But if they pay full market rent, full market prices for this, they are at a disadvantage, and we hear like 80% of businesses fail in the first 5 years.
Yeah.
So if we reduce the costs of doing business for local entrepreneurs on a temporary basis, according to Jane Jacobs' theory, we would have a lot more economic development in the actual city.
Now, doesn't this also kind of make a case for a bit more socialism, or at least social democracy in the economy, so that people can actually afford to fail and take the risks and know that there's a safety net waiting for them, because that's the problem with...
Absolutely. There is no doubt in my mind that she would be supportive of that for small businesses and anybody in general, but that would be an effective tool to help economic development, and in fact it's a social tool to help mobility. You do not fall back, you can still move up though. And anything that stops you from moving up, like a welfare system that claws back anytime you try and get a job, is harmful for economic development. These people who are on the fringes of society, they see the problems that are in the world today, and if they had the means and the freedom to actually try and solve them, the world would be a better place.
Okay, now let me hit you with bit of a big picture Marxist critique here.
Okay.
Okay, so let's say we do all these things. Doesn't that still leave intact the problems of consumerism and production for the sake of production rather than production for what's for need and production based on what's available and what's sustainable? And she doesn't really address this, especially with global warming and the climate catastrophe coming up.
So those are all problems that there are vested, from her perspective, those are problems that have that there are vested interests that want to keep them there. She believes, it's an article of faith with her, because you're right, she doesn't get into it very much, but she believes that any prolonged problem is a result of exactly that. Somebody trying to thwart somebody else from coming up with a viable, better solution.
Right, but you still need production to keep going, right? For these economies to keep moving, which requires consumerism.
So yes and no. In this book she doesn't cover this, but in a book that she wrote in 2001, she talks about how it moves, how we've essentially solved the material production problem.
Yep.
Future production becomes immaterial. Immaterial in the sense that instead of having to acquire more and more clothing
and toothbrushes,
we get more education, which doesn't take up space. As an example, that
or even digital
storage devices, yes, and storage. So those are innovative solutions to the quest for greater materiality. So the push right now in Kingston for more affordable transit and more transit in general removes the need for more cars. A bus takes up less space than if everyone in the bus had cars. That's an example of moving from material to immaterial, or less material in one sense. She would see that as a long-term trend within the economic development, and there'd be thousands, perhaps infinite number of possibilities there, limited only by our imagination. Also only limited also by the established interests that may want to stop that.
Okay. Well, do you want to leave our audience with a final word on Jane Jacobs?
Jane Jacobs has been mostly thought of as an urban planner, and she did challenge all of that. But I personally believe that the economics that she spoke about in this book is a new type of economics, directed specifically at cities, where microeconomics and macroeconomics deal with the firm or with the country as a whole. The city is something different. It's not a country because it doesn't have the ability to create its own money or its own currency, and it's not a firm because it has a very limited, geographically limited space. Firms are, in theory, can travel all over or sell anywhere in the world. This is a different kind of entity that is not covered in most economic courses. The result is that she has essentially come up with a third type of economics for municipal government, and it's not really being appreciated.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeff.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely.